XRP's biggest DeFi move just went live, and most investors may not realize why this matters yet. For years, the XRP conversation has focused heavily on price, regulation, ETFs, and the Clarity Act. But something different is happening now. The XRP ecosystem is expanding into a part of crypto that could have a much bigger impact on how XRP is actually used: DeFi lending and collateral. According to the source material, XRP can now be used as collateral through FXRP, opening the door to lending markets where XRP can be connected to institutional-style financial activity. And that changes the conversation, because there is a major difference between simply holding XRP and having XRP become an asset that can actually be used inside financial applications. The new setup involves XRP being converted into FXRP through Flare. That FXRP can then be supplied into a lending vault, allowing users to borrow a dollar-based asset while their XRP remains part of the collateral structure. And according to the transcript, this isn't being presented as just another retail experiment. The speaker describes it as a major milestone for institutional DeFi, with the potential for institutions holding large amounts of XRP to participate in these lending markets. That's the part XRP holders should pay attention to, because if XRP can increasingly be used as collateral, its role begins moving beyond simply being something investors buy and hold while waiting for the price to rise. It becomes part of a financial system where the asset itself can potentially be put to work. And that leads to an even bigger question: could this create additional demand for XRP over time? The source argues that as more XRP gets locked into collateral, ETFs, and other applications on the XRP ledger, the amount of XRP readily available in the market could decrease. But we need to be careful here. A potential reduction in available supply does not automatically guarantee a price explosion. That's an important distinction. The real story is whether this new utility actually attracts meaningful capital, users, institutions, and liquidity. If it does, then XRP could gradually become more deeply integrated into decentralized financial markets. And here's where this gets even more interesting. The transcript argues that this development could continue with or without the Clarity Act. That doesn't mean regulation doesn't matter. It means the XRP ecosystem may be developing additional utility while the regulatory debate continues. So the question isn't simply, will XRP go up? The better question is XRP becoming more useful? And if the answer continues to move in that direction, investors may eventually look at XRP very differently than they do today. But there's one critical part of this new DeFi development that we still need to understand: how exactly XRP gets locked, converted, and used as collateral, and what that could mean for XRP supply. That's where things get really interesting. So how does this new XRP DeFi system actually work, and why could it matter for XRP holders? The basic idea is that XRP can be used as collateral rather than simply sitting untouched in a wallet. According to the source material, XRP is first converted into FXRP through Flare. The FXRP can then be deposited into a lending vault, where users can borrow a dollar-based asset, while the XRP-backed the position remains part of the collateral structure. And this is important because it creates another potential use case for XRP. Instead of selling XRP to access liquidity, a holder could potentially use the asset as collateral and access borrowed capital while maintaining exposure to XRP. That is the basic concept behind collateralized lending. But the bigger story is what happens if this type of infrastructure grows. The source describes the development as a major step toward institutional DeFi, particularly because institutions that hold large amounts of XRP could potentially participate in these lending markets. Imagine a large institution holding a significant XRP position. Historically, that XRP could simply sit on the balance sheet. Now, the ecosystem is developing mechanisms where XRP can potentially become productive collateral. That doesn't guarantee institutions will use it at massive scale, but it creates a new possibility that didn't exist in the same way before. And this is where the supply argument comes into the conversation. The source's thesis is that when XRP is locked as collateral, held through ETFs, or used inside applications on the XRP ledger, some of that supply is effectively removed from immediately available market liquidity. If adoption expands significantly, the argument is that this could eventually contribute to a supply squeeze. But let's be realistic. Supply being locked does not automatically mean XRP's price will explode. Price still depends on demand, liquidity, market conditions, and how much real economic activity develops around these systems. That's why this development is worth watching without turning it into another unrealistic XRP prediction. There is another important detail here. The source argues that these developments can continue with or without the Clarity Act. XRP DeFi is already developing. while the broader regulatory debate continues. That doesn't make regulation irrelevant. Clear regulation could still influence institutional confidence and broader adoption, but it means XRP holders shouldn't necessarily think that everything is frozen until Washington makes a decision. The technology and financial infrastructure can continue evolving in parallel, and that's perhaps the biggest takeaway from this story. The XRP narrative may gradually be shifting from when will XRP finally pump to what can XRP actually be used for? Because if XRP becomes collateral, liquidity, and infrastructure inside larger financial applications, then its utility becomes much easier to measure. And that could be far more important over the long term than one headline or one political vote. But there is still one major question left. If more XRP gets locked into these systems, how much could actually be removed from circulating liquidity, and could that eventually create the supply shock everyone keeps talking about? Could this new DeFi activity create a supply shock for XRP? That's the big question. If more XRP is being used as collateral, held through ETFs, or locked inside applications, then less XRP may be immediately available in the open market. The source argues that these different uses could gradually absorb available supply, but nobody can honestly say how large that potential supply shock will become. What we can say is that XRP is gaining another use case, and that may be more important than simply waiting for the next headline about the Clarity Act. Because this development is happening with or without the Clarity Act. If institutional participation grows, DeFi expands, and more XRP becomes tied up as collateral, the market could eventually look very different from today. But don't turn that possibility into a guaranteed price prediction. The real thing to watch is adoption. Is more capital entering? Are institutions actually using XRP? Is demand growing alongside the utility? Those answers will tell us whether this is just another crypto headline or the beginning of something much bigger. So tell me, do you think XRP's new DeFi utility could become the catalyst for its next major move? Let me know in the comments and subscribe to OG John XRP Insights for the next XRP update.